And that got to let me warm up, although I'm afraid the topic of today is going to be a very different one. I'm sure that most of the people who come to services regularly are also regular digesters of Jewish news. And we have certainly been spending a great deal of time talking about the news of Israel and certain other elements in the Jewish world. But one thing that has been slowly processing up until this last week has been the trial of the mass murderer at the Tree of Life Synagogue up in Pittsburgh. People were paying attention to this. What was the final verdict for this murderer? Death. He is now slated for execution. Now, there are complications within the American system of exactly when and where capital punishment can take place. But as Jews, not necessarily as somebody who's looking at American law, but as someone who looks at Judaism, is death an appropriate reaction to certain crimes? A life for a life. One of the first rules that we see in the Torah preceding the giving of Torah itself, I know there's always that irony that the Torah is written before the Torah is given, but we have a few thousand years, and in this case, right after Noah is on scene, and after the flood, we are told, one that spills blood, his blood shall be spilled. So therefore, it's obvious, right? This person is guilty of murder multiple times over, therefore, the punishment is execution. Is that all Judaism has to say about this topic? Right, there are other types of taking life that don't fall into this category. So for example, if you accidentally kill someone, you're out using your lawnmower, and although you've kept it in good repair, somehow, some way, it disassembles itself, and part of that lawnmower flies across the street and strikes someone, and God forbid they die. You are not the same as somebody who loads up a machine gun and walks into a synagogue to kill the people that he stupidly believed were trying to undermine the right race. That was his motivation. If you didn't know, look up Great Replacement Theory if you want to see a scary, terrible, and unfortunately widespread belief among many people. And of course, you would not execute a person for such an accidental death as our lawnmower incident. Likewise, if somebody is engaged in war, if they are a soldier defending their country, then they are not considered to be a murderer. If they are a person who is trying to save another, themselves included, if somebody is pursuing another one, the classic legal term is rodef, and you need to step in to stop them from harming another, and the only way, that is an important caveat, the only way to stop them is with lethal force, then you are absolved of blood guilt for having stopped them using lethal force, because it was the only way to prevent them from murdering someone else. In all of those cases, Judaism does not consider that person a murderer. So there are limitations to a life for a life. It's not 100% every life that is taken requires another life in punishment. Which means that we have to then unravel, well, why are we executing anyone? What's actually going on here? If it's not a pure balancing karmic scales of the universe sort of notion, that a life was taken, so therefore another life must be taken in punishment, and we recognize the illogical impossibility of ever balancing those scales if it were truly a life, for then every executioner would become a new murderer and the cycle would continue forever, then there must be something else going on. In Judaism, we do not conceive of the death penalty as being a deterrent. We do not execute one person in order to persuade potential criminals from not committing such atrocities. We do not see humans as being teacher aides for making a point. In Judaism, we don't consider it to be a slaking of the bloodlust that is found within the society. The mob is baying for blood at the outrage of this crime. Someone has to be killed in order to slake the thirst of the horde, in order to show them that justice, in quotes, has been done. Judaism is not a fan of that type of ideology either. And by the way, both of these, of course, have been advanced in different cultures, communities over the ages. Judaism, not so much. So what do we think we're actually accomplishing with a death sentence? And understand that Judaism has been uncomfortable with the death sentence for a very, very long time. When we get into the rabbinic writings, which give us much more commentary and exposition about the implementation of the Torah, the rabbis are very reticent to simply take a person out and execute them. There has to be a very proper judicial procedure, the rules of which are much more rigorous than any other case that comes before a high court in Jewish law. The witnesses are interrogated quite forcefully. That is to say, since we are relying upon their eyewitness testimony, we literally exhaust them. It's not quite torture, but running them up and down stairs until the point where they are not thinking straight, and then we can get them to just tell us what actually happened rather than their scripted version of what they think they saw happen. We make sure that all of the people that are involved in the court, the different rabbis that are sitting in court, are given proper time and consideration to raise any potential objections, any potential reasons why this person might not be guilty or might not be guilty of the capital punishment for this. It, in fact, goes so far as rabbis in the Talmud to say that they would always find a reason to exonerate someone because they were so uncomfortable with this notion that we could be 100% sure when we were executing this person that indeed they were guilty and deserving of this particular form of execution. So with all of that in mind, what was the Torah thinking? If we've got rabbis going back 2,500 years who are uncomfortable with this, if we have very little evidence of actual death sentences being carried out in Jewish law, if we have throughout the rest of our Jewish history so much discussion of how precisely this could even be navigated so as to be fair and to be just, and if we are not doing this for deterrence, if we're not doing this to remove a boil from the society, if you're not doing this in order to slake the mob, what are we doing it for? Why would the Torah even ask us to do this in the first place? You have an idea?
It's because it's to teach and let everybody know that evil cannot continue to go on.
No. That one's an easy one. No. That's called deterrence. And Judaism doesn't make a utilitarian calculation that killing a few people, whether it's right or wrong, and we're not 100% sure, but we're probably okay, it's good because everyone else will get the message. No. We are not allowed to sacrifice people in order to teach society what we want them to learn, or else things would get messy real fast. And the baying mob speaks, right? We abhor this. It's terrible. The crime itself is so bad. It cries out for justice, that this be absolved in a way that removes this stain on society. This is our kishkas telling us this cannot stand.
Well, in the same sense that if we were to wipe out populations to practice idolatry, I mean, it's a purification of some sort.
I would argue we subjugated populations with idolatry. They always had the option of peaceful surrender and no longer practicing their abominations. Unfortunately, that was indeed what they made inevitable, but it was not inevitable, meaning that we will see later on in Deuteronomy, when you approach a city to make war against it, you offer it peace, and there are multiple ways that it did not have to end in warfare. Unfortunately, God being God, God knew what would inevitably come to pass in the Canaanite areas. But you'll notice that Judaism never went on a global crusade to murder idolaters once they had secured a place that they could live. But the reason I think we're struggling with the actual Torah reason of why we have executions is because it seems so foreign to our modern mind. We are doing it in order that the murderer can properly atone for their sin. Death is kapara, as in Yom Kippur, root word. Death is atonement. And when a murderer has committed a sin, they need atonement. Now, there are a couple ways to get atonement in Judaism, generally. Generally, if you accidentally, kind of, sort of, eat a double bacon cheeseburger, Right? The general means of atonement is to do teshuvah, and in the ancient world, you would bring a korban, you would bring a sacrifice to the temple. And you would admit your guilt, you would admit your regret, and the sacrifice would atone for the transgression that you had made. Now, if you didn't atone, if you went, ha 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 ha, wow, I'm so lucky I got to eat that, what does Judaism say is the long-term ramification of non-atoned for sins? I'll give you a hint, it's not eternal damnation. It's karet for certain crimes. Karet means death at the hands of heaven, which means God now has freedom to smite you when appropriate. Doesn't mean it's going to be lightning bolts, but it does mean that you have forfeited your right to continue. Very, very few transgressions have karet. It's not a very common punishment for the more common types of actions. It's a common punishment for rather large transgressions. The general feeling is that eventually, if you don't get your justice in this world, you'll get your justice in the next. And it's not eternal damnation, but it will be proportional. So let's imagine you are the unrepentant double bacon cheeseburger eater. There will be a time, says Judaism, that when you pass from this world, you will have to atone for that before the throne of God. Meaning that there will be a time when the guilt of that will have to be expunged from your spirit. You will feel regret before God, even if you feel no regret now. And that regret will be, quote, suffering, and that will then remove the sin from you, and you will now be pure. It's gone. Remember, as we said in the very first blessing this morning, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tohorahi, the soul that you gave me, God, is pure. The soul is indelible. It cannot be ruined. It can be covered over by our transgression. But, with a good scrub of the brush, it will come clean again always. Perfect. It's better than glass for cleaning up. And that should happen in this world with repentance, with teshuvah, and with the various means of atonement in this life. However, if we leave it, if we don't make our teshuvah, we don't repent, we are unrepentant, we do not see the flaw of what we have done, perhaps we even celebrate our crimes, well, eventually when you stand before the throne of the Holy One, you will not be able to deceive yourself into thinking that what you did was right. And all of the guilt and suffering that comes from that feeling will happen at that moment. Not pleasant, so our teachings tell us. So what does this have to do with murder? Well, if you are a murderer, you have committed one of the worst crimes that you can possibly commit. We talked about idolatry last week. We're doing murder today. No guarantees on next week. I'm still working on that. How do you atone for that? Can you bring a sacrifice to atone for your willful murder of another person? No. Doesn't feel fair, and the Torah agrees. No, in fact, that doesn't work. Can you bring a large penalty payment, blood money, as it was called in many other communities, a sack of gold to the victim's family and say, I'm so sorry that I murdered them. I feel absolutely terrible. I don't know what I was thinking. Here's $5 million, and we're good, right? No? Not so much? No. Life for life, says Judaism. You cannot buy your way out of the guilt of murder. You cannot sacrifice your way through lambs and goats and bullocks out of murder. The only way to finally atone is to first feel regret, to actually do teshuvah, to feel the terror of what you have done, to realize that what you did was among the worst wrongs that could possibly be done to another person, and then die. And then die. There is no way to properly atone for taking another person's life until you are gone, having experienced that proper regret, having experienced that proper teshuvah. But Judaism believes that the proper regret and teshuvah of the murderer is important. Not it harmonizes the cosmic scales. It's important for that murderer. Because that murderer is still a human being. And they deserve to feel regret. They deserve to do contrition. And they deserve to be absolved. They just don't deserve to go on living in this world once all that's taken care of. But Judaism, especially when we used to adjudicate these cases under our own law, gave very important time, exhortation, to make sure that those who were sentenced to die properly did teshuvah before the execution was carried out. Not before sentence was passed. This was not a, "Oh, Your Honor, I am so sorry. Before you pass sentence, let me tell you how pious I am," kind of thing. This was, no, you're definitely going to die. In fact, right down that road is where we're taking to push you off a cliff to stone you. That's how stoning was done. And there's no way out of that unless a witness comes that tells that the other witnesses were lying, and then we get into a whole complicated additional appeals process. But apart from that, apart from new testimony of your innocence, you are going to die. Between now and you dying, we really think you should do teshuvah for your sake. It's not going to get you out of your sentence. It's not like we're going to commute your death sentence to life in prison. They didn't have prisons back then. That was not a thing. This is it, your final moments. Can you actually recognize that what you did was a horror? Can your soul return from wherever place it was when it committed that crime and recognize that what you did was literally terrible? And can you feel that regret? Can you feel sorrow for having made others weep by your actions? Can you feel revulsion at how far you strayed from where God created you? If you can, then when you die at this execution point, you will not carry that guilt into the next world. And that's the part that I find a lot of people recoil at. Are you telling me, Rabbi, we take a murderer and they, okay, I'll buy into it, they sincerely regret their crime, not in order to try and get out of the sentence or to prove their innocence, but they sincerely regret it, knowing there is no escape from the execution they are about to face. You're telling me that person who sincerely repents, once they are dead, they stand before God blameless? And Judaism says yes. Absolutely. They are a human being. They made the worst mistake that is possible, but human beings make mistakes. And human beings are offered forgiveness by God. Not carte blanche. You have to actually be sincere, and God knows whether you're sincere, not like a judge who might be swayed by crocodile tears. But if this person sincerely realizes the guilt of their crime with no ulterior motive other than to allow themselves to recognize the terrible thing they did, then why should they stand before God with any more guilt than the rest of us who do the same process? Are we trying to make them suffer more? Are we going to feel better knowing that they are in a lake of fire? That they have to do double what we do? Exactly where would you draw the line then on the different crimes the Torah lays out for whether or not your teshuvah in this world works or whether you're going to have to do double duty in the next? Tell me which crime becomes the tipping point. That your honest confession and your actual execution are not sufficient in this world, but that you want some additional punishment in the afterlife. Again, we're not talking about unrepentant murderers here. We're not talking about those who go to their grave holding on, clinging to whatever ideology or hate was in their heart when they perpetrated their acts. We're talking about someone who legitimately, and for the record, I have heard nothing from the killer in Tree of Life that says that he is repentant at all. Only the things I have heard is that he was sad that fewer people joined in his cause. So this is not about him. This is about Judaism's ideas for execution in general. Barbara, you had your hand up.
Yes, I believe Israel does not have a death penalty, with the exception of the ones for Nazi war criminals, and they did it under the impetus of the Nuremberg trials, not their own. Is that true? Israel still does not have a death penalty?
It is true that Israel does not have the death penalty. Of course, Israeli soldiers and police, just like in any other country, will often have to take the life of terrorists and others in the act of stopping them from either committing or continuing their deeds. But once a person has been apprehended peacefully and put into prison, Israel does not have the death sentence except for, as you mentioned, crimes committed during the Holocaust. So far, that has been just one, yes. But it is officially, potentially able for others. But the clock is running out on longevity for that to be likely.
The first murder, Cain, likely did not know what he was doing, but his mechanism of silence was unused for him, and he had to roam the road. Is that
So yes, the murder of Abel by Cain is one of the more challenging passages in Torah, and in a section full of challenging passages. We have to look at this as being more than a particular individual's struggle, and instead seeing the story of Cain as being instructive of humanity's struggle with violence, with our temptation to use lethal force when we are upset, and trying to steer ourselves away from that. And indeed, the interesting thing about the mark of Cain was not a mark against him. It was, he actually became a warning to others not to do to him what he had done to his brother, that strangers should not treat him the way he had treated his kin. He became a signpost, if you will, of don't behave like me. If you behave like me, now that there's an example, your punishment will be even worse than this. It was a way to make sure that others would not murder Cain, just as a random stranger in their communities. So it is, like you said, like I said, a very complicated section. I do need to wrap it up, so I just want to finish with one last little element to help you understand that our ancestors were able to separate the need to carry out an execution correctly and properly because the Torah has commanded it, because the evidentiary laws have been met, the adjudication has been held fairly, and this is the punishment that is needed in order to allow this criminal, if they repent, to properly atone. That nevertheless, when all of those conditions have been met, the person is still treated with humanity and dignity all the way until the last moment. When they are taking them to that cliff for stoning, there is a debate in the Talmud. Do we push them off the cliff clothed or naked? Well, what are the pros and cons, they argue. They say, well, when someone is clothed, they still have their dignity, they still have their self-respect. They are not open to the derision of the mob. But when they are clothed, they also are going to be padded, which means when they strike the ground below, you are increasing the odds that they will survive the initial impact and linger, and not either die immediately or perhaps not even have a fatal wound. They compromise. They don't want them to suffer. They don't want them to linger. The execution is not about extracting pain from the murderer to make up for the pain of the victims. The execution is about fulfilling what Torah has told us we must do and giving that person, if they are repentant, that door open into atonement. And so the compromise is a piece of cloth. You will stand naked at the top of the cliff, and you will hold a piece of cloth, and then you will die. This way, they still have the privacy of their private parts, but they will not suffer unduly at the end, the terminus of their fall. And they make an additional exception. If the criminal is a woman, she gets 2. One in front and one behind. Now, I know many of my colleagues, when we first came across this passage in the Talmud, we thought this was a bit laughable. You're really worried about humiliating a murderer? You're really worried about their sense of dignity? You're worried about how they're going to be treated by the crowd? And also, of course, wait, is that all that actually needs to be covered for a person not to be considered naked? And by the way, yes, kind of technically in Jewish law, that is the minimum. We have other guidelines, but as far as minimums go, that's it. But as we continue to debate and discuss and read the way the rabbis understood this passage, we recognized the incredible humanity they were trying to teach for the rest of us. Because executions may not be an actual deterrence. It may not be a teaching moment about criminality. But it can be a teaching moment about humanity. The verse that is cited when the rabbis are arguing about how to properly prepare a person for execution is, you will love your neighbor as yourself. You will love them in life to ensure their life is humane, compassionate, and dignified. And you will love them in death, even as a criminal, to make sure their death is humane, compassionate, and dignified. If you can take a person's life while still loving them, because you believe it is the right thing to do, and they recognize that this is the only path for true atonement for them, then we can recognize that justice in that case can be done. But if you take someone's life with hate, with anger, if you revel in suffering, and if you wish to prolong the process because you are still so angry, so outraged by their deeds, if you refuse to even admit that they are still a human being because of what they did, then we are missing what our sages tried to teach us, and we are missing what the Torah tried to guide us towards. Executions and the death penalty is not contrary to Jewish law. Hate is. It is hate that motivates so many of the atrocities that we see these days. It is hate we have to stay away from, even as we carry out the most final of ends for a person. Shabbat Shalom.